Hey guys, my name is Anirudh Menon and I welcome you all to my channel. So I am a third year medical student at Government Medical College, Thrissur, Kerala. Okay. So yeah, I got requests and suggestions for incorporating videos related to the medical curriculum in the works that I do. So that's exactly what I'm going to do in this particular video. So I have thought of making a video for the second year students and concerning the histopathology slides that are asked in the practical exams that they have. Okay. So yes, I have taken all the slides from my university, my college, whichever slides they are asking us to learn and they are asking in the exam. I have taken all those things. So there can be some region-wise variation with respect to the university that you are following or you are learning in. So if there is any slide that is lacking in these videos, please let me know in the comment box below so that I can make a separate video for that. Okay. So yeah, I am just proceeding on to how to demystify these contents. How do you proceed with these contents first of all? So if you are a second year student, what you can do is that you can watch the respective part. That means that particular part of the slide that you can directly select with the time sequence that will be providing in the comment box below before and after the practicals while you prepare, so that you can revise these things very easily and you can just keep them, jot these points down in a notebook and you can just read that before or you can use that just before the practical time so that you can get all the necessary points which are necessary to understand the slide over there. It becomes the exam time. When exam time is nearer, what you can do is that you need to revise these things for theory exam as well as for the practical exam, definitely. So you can watch the video after you complete a slide, or whichever way you want. You can watch the video before you start learning, or you can watch that respective part while you start learning particular histopathology image in your textbook, whichever way you can do. And I am following the textbook of Robbins itself for making these videos. Okay, so let's proceed into the topic now. Okay guys, so in this video we will start up with the bone tumors, and the first one that we are supposed to know is osteosarcoma. First point, age. Age is actually having a bimodal age distribution, right? So it can be having a peak. If you see the graph, there is a peak in both ages. Okay, so the first peak occurs in 10 to 20 years of age when you're an adolescent and young adults. So this is called as the primary osteosarcoma, and then there is another peak after 45 years, that is adulthood. Okay, so you will call this as the secondary osteosarcoma, where primary osteosarcoma is the most common, okay, than secondary osteosarcoma. Site, we are supposed to understand it is present in which of the parts of a bone. So please understand this is present in metaphysis. Fine, this is present in metaphysis. This is a tumor which occurs in metaphysis. Okay, distal end of tibia and distal end of femur and proximal tibia. So distal part of the femur, okay, and proximal part of the tibia. So if at all a patient is coming with a night increase in temperature, there are all other features of malignancy, all the constitutional symptoms with a lot of pain in that particular area, this is one of the differential diagnoses that we are supposed to consider in orthopedics. See, mutation is very simple. At least remember two genes over here, P53 mutation and your favorite retinoblastoma gene mutation. These two genes are obviously learned in that particular topic of neoplasia. These two genes are supposed to be remembered over there. MDM2 gene mutation are also present there. We don't have to go into so much of details because we are just supposed to learn for the exam and pass in it, right? So retinoblastoma, whenever a patient is having a sporadic or familiar retinoblastoma, that patient will definitely have an increased risk of osteosarcoma. Now, a germline mutation in P53 gene is called by the name of Li-Fraumeni syndrome, isn't it? So, if a patient is having Li-Fraumeni syndrome, there is an increased risk of osteosarcoma. So, this increased risk of osteosarcoma can be seen in Li-Fraumeni syndrome and retinoblastoma as well. Metastasis will occur into the lungs. Lungs is the most common, it seems, and also there is bone. So this bone to bone metastasis, the malignancy is arising in a bone and this is again going into another bone. So this bone to bone metastasis is seen typically in two tumors. Most commonly it is seen in Ewing sarcoma, and second most common is osteosarcoma. So in Ewing sarcoma and osteosarcoma, this bone to bone metastasis is present. So if you can very typically write, if they are asking what is the site of bone tumors in the discussions for the gross specimens, or even if they are asking this question in the along with the slides, you can write this, because this is a very peculiar feature shown by Ewing sarcoma as well as osteosarcoma. Ewing's is not given in our college, but yes, osteosarcoma is present. So this is something that you can go give over there. So let's proceed into this discussion of this particular image. the histopathology over here. See, these are the tumor cells. These are actually bizarre arrangement of tumor cells, isn't it? They are pleomorphic. They have hyperchromaticity. See, hyperchromaticity can be seen over here, isn't it? It is completely bizarre arrangement. What is seen over here? This is the atypical mitosis that you can see in this particular image. Atypical mitosis can be seen here. Okay, so multipolar mitosis, which you can say, or atypical mitosis is seen in this particular arrow, whichever cell this arrow is pointing into, and these cells are going to secrete these kind of structures. These are the osteoids. Okay, osteoid matrix is secreted by this, and since this is secreted by the malignant cells, we call it by the name of malignant osteoid, and this is the most classical diagnostic feature of osteosarcoma that we are supposed to find out. If this is seen in the slide that is given to you in the examination, there is no doubt about any other things. The answer is osteosarcoma. And if at all this person, the examiners are giving you a case history also, then there is nothing much to think about it. Your answer is there in front of you, that is osteosarcoma. So this is the most classical diagnostic features, these structures which are called by the name of malignant osteoids, which are secreted by the tumor cells because they are tumor cells or malignant cells of the bone itself, right? So this is the bizarre arrangement. Now we have lace-like arrangement of the cells. These cells are highly atypical cells. Pleomorphism, atypical mitosis, everything can be seen over here. So there is pleomorphism, hyperchromaticity, abnormal mitotic figures. That abnormal mitotic figures could be seen in that particular image. Okay, so and there is malignant osteoid formation. This is the most classical feature. So if at all you are writing an answer in one word or two words, then you will definitely have to write this particular sentence because this is the most characteristic diagnostic finding. X-ray features. Okay, X-ray features, one is this Codman's triangle. See, Codman's triangle is actually not specific for osteosarcoma. It can be seen in multiple other conditions as well. But if a person of this much age, like 10 to 20 years of age, is coming with all the classical symptoms and features of osteosarcoma, then only this has a significance. And the other one is called as sunburst appearance. Okay, sunburst appearance is actually due to the fact that calcium is depositing in the soft tissue which is surrounding the tumor cells because it is a malignancy, right? So this is all we are supposed to know in osteosarcoma for clearing the exam. Let's proceed to the next one. So the next one is osteochondroma. We are again beginning with the age itself. This is seen in adulthood. Okay, site is metaphysis here of trabecular bones. Okay, it is given like it is present in trabecular bones of the hands and feet. It is also given in the textbook that it is present in the tubular bones of the knee area or the lower limbs. Wherever if it is happening, site is actually the metaphysis. Okay, the mutation is actually EXT1 mutation, EXT2 gene mutation. So these are certain genes you can remember. So if at all they are asking the mutation over here, so it is very easy to pick up this in the microscope. Everything is very easy if you know the characteristic as such. See, what you see over here is, this is the cartilage part. Okay, this is the cartilage part and this is the bone part. Okay, so this exostosis is coming out. So this is a growth that is coming out of the bone, long bone, and this is covered with the cartilage. So this is the cartilage cap which is covering it, and this cartilage cap is going to have a well formed perichondrium, right? The perichondrium of this cartilage is well formed in this case. Fine. So this is the perichondrium, as you can see over here. This outermost covering will be the perichondrium. Okay, so there is a cartilage cap which is made up of benign mature hyaline cartilage. See, the color itself is blue, right? Color itself is blue, and this is very typical, very classical of the hyaline cartilage itself. So this is made up of hyaline cartilage. To be more precise in answering, you can say benign mature hyaline cartilage. It is a mature, not an immature cartilage. You will be able to see this cell nest arrangement inside the part if you're more zooming inside. In this figure it is not very clear, but yes, cell nest arrangement can be seen over here, and here the cells will be arranged in the linear fashion. Whatever we have learned in anatomy, that if it is a mature cartilage, all these things will be present. So it is benign mature hyaline cartilage. It is covered by a well formed perichondrium, right? And it undergoes endochondral ossification. That means this is going to ossify into a bone. It is going to ossify into a bone, and you can see this osteoid secretion over here. So whatever is the newly formed bone out of this cartilage, it is coming to this side. Okay, this is how the bone is actually developing. Fine, this cartilage will ossify into a bone, and this newly formed bone will be coming into this particular direction, into the inner surface of the cartilage. Fine. And the point to remember is that the cortex of the exophysis, okay, exostosis, this particular tumor, the cortex of this tumor and the cortex of the bone are in continuity, and the medullary cavity of the long bone and the medullary cavity of the tumor are also in continuity. So this is a very classical sentence you will see in all descriptions of this particular state of this particular tumor, that the cortex is in continuity with that of the long bone. Even the medullary cavity will be also in continuity with that of the long bone. Fine. It undergoes endochondral ossification. That is all we are supposed to know here. Let's proceed to the next one. So the last one is giant cell tumor, also called by the name of osteoclastoma. Remember, these are actually benign tumors, but they are locally aggressive. Okay, so these are benign tumors which are locally aggressive. So it is almost equivalent to saying that it is a malignancy. The point is, it is actually arising not from osteoclast. They are actually arising not from osteoclast, even though they are called as osteoclastoma. They are actually arising from primitive osteoblastic precursor cells. Okay, primitive osteoblastic precursor cells. Now these primitive osteoblastic precursor cells, which are actually precursors of osteoblast, they exhibit an increased amount of rank ligand. Okay, rank ligand attaches to there is an increased amount of rank ligand which is exhibited by these malignant cells, which are primitive osteoblastic precursor cells. These are the malignant cells here. Now remember, this particular increased rank ligand will require a receptor. Now these receptors are called as the rank receptors. These receptors, which are called as the rank receptors, are present on osteoclast. Okay, on the osteoclast, this rank receptor is present. So this increased rank ligand will go and attach over the rank receptors present on osteoclast, which leads to increased differentiation of osteoclast precursors into osteoclast. So there is an increased production of osteoclast over there, and that is why in this particular image you will be seeing these osteoclast type giant cells. Okay, why are these coming? Because of increased amount of rank ligand production by the primitive osteoblastic precursor cells. These are going and attaching to their receptors present on the osteoclast. That leads to increased differentiation of osteoclast and increased production of osteoclast. So this is the typical features which you see over here. So these are the multinucleated giant cells which are called as osteoclast type giant cells. Site, this is the only tumor among the tumors which we are supposed to learn for the pathology exam, which is actually present in epiphysis, which will be asked in your practical test. Okay, this is only the tumor which is present in epiphysis. Fine, the age is actually 20 to 40 years of age. Okay, younger adults too, I mean middle age. Okay, and X-ray finding is and the X-ray finding is soap bubble appearance. I think this is not visible if I write over here. So soap bubble appearance is the X-ray finding as such. Fine, now I think it is visible now. Now the point to remember is that see, osteoclast type giant cells are the most commonly encountered cells over here. The moment you see this, you will say that it is actually osteoclastoma or the giant cell tumor, which are multinucleated. See, this is the point to remember. But these are not the malignant cells. These are not the malignant cells. The malignant cells are primitive osteoblastic precursor cells, which are the mononuclear cells which are present over here. See, these are the malignant cells, which I am now shading with the dark green. Okay, these are the mononuclear cells which are primitive osteoblastic precursors, which are the malignant component here. Now remember, some of the gross features are also very much important. You can get this as a gross question also. There you will have to see this as a club shaped mass. So it is a club shaped mass where there is cystic degeneration, hemorrhage. Fine, these are certain features over there. So I am not going to the details of the gross specimens here, just discussing with you the features of the microscopy of the osteoclastoma or giant cell tumor. Fine, remember that osteoclasts are not the malignant component here. Malignant cells in this particular image are your primitive osteoblastic precursor cells, which are the other mononuclear cells which are present over there. So this misconception should be actually removed from your mind. So that is all we are supposed to know from the bone tumors. Okay, so let's proceed to the next topic. Okay guys, so this is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Fine, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is the most common cause of thyroid disease, hypothyroidism, in areas where there are sufficient quantities of iodine which is available. So in areas where there are sufficient quantities of iodine which is available over there, the most common cause of hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Let's talk about the mutation over here, that is PTPN22 and CTLA4. These are the mutations over here. It has a strong HLA association, DR3 and DR5. Okay. See, the interesting point is this female to male ratio. It is around 10:1, or it can be even 20:1 also. This is also given as 20:1 in some other books. See, this reminds me of the SLE condition, isn't it? So this can remind me of SLE condition because there the prevalence is around 9:1 in that case. Antibodies are produced as a result of that. Now here the point is to remember the name of antibodies here. The first one is anti-thyroglobulin antibody, and the second one is anti-microsomal antibody. Okay, so these names should be remembered there. They can directly ask you this question. See, now let's have a look into this particular image. This is a Dobbins image. I have directly taken that, and the slide which is there in the college will be exactly similar to this. See, this is something that is very much similar to the normal architecture that you can see inside a thyroid, isn't it? You have these kind of follicles, it has a colloid, but you see these are actually atrophic follicles. There is follicular damage. So whatever is lining the follicle will be atrophic. Fine. Now these cells which are lining the follicles, the cells that are lining these atrophic follicles are called by the name of Hürthle cells or Eskenazi cells or oxyphil cells. Three names for the same cell. And the characteristic feature of this particular Hürthle cell that lines these atrophic follicles is that it is highly eosinophilic, highly granular. See, that is the important point to remember over here. So these atrophic follicles can be seen over here, and this is the other part of the thyroid that you can see. This is the affected area. Everything is affected. See, in this particular region that I am just demarcating now, you can see there is extreme lymphocytic infiltration. So there is extreme lymphocytic infiltration. Fine. Now this lymphocytes are going to form these kind of follicles. You see, it is actually when lot of lymphocytes are coming inside the thyroid, it tries to mimic a secondary lymphoid organ. So it starts forming lymphoid follicles. So the lymphocytes are excessively coming inside the thyroid gland. It starts mimicking a secondary lymphoid organ where there is these kind of big lymphoid follicles, and these are the germinal centers. So these are the germinal centers which are very characteristically seen in this particular diagram. Fine. So these are the most important features that you need to remember so far as the histopathology of Hashimoto's thyroiditis is concerned. Remember that this kind of a disease can occur in relation to, you see, it is an autoimmune disease anyway, so it can occur in association with many other autoimmune diseases, say type 2 diabetes mellitus, SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, then all the other things, Klinefelter syndrome, Down syndrome, Turner syndrome. So it occurs in association with all these things, and the HLA factor is much more important compared to the other diseases in this kind of a situation, and it occurs in females more commonly. Remember, the Hürthle cells are actually a part of metaplasia, and you will call this as oncocytic metaplasia. It is a cellular adaptation where there is change from one adult cell type to the other adult cell type, right? Okay, so follicular damage, presence of atrophic follicles that we have seen. Fine. Now the Hürthle cell, Eskenazi cell, and oxyphil cells, three names for the same cell. It is characterized by the presence of eosinophilic and granular cytoplasm, and it is a marker of oncocytic metaplasia. This is the process by which the Hürthle cells are coming into picture. Fine. There is lymphocytic infiltrate. There will be excessive formation with well-formed germinal centers. So this will be the germinal centers, and this is how these round structures will be seen inside the diagram or the slide that is given to you in the examination. Now, long-standing disease can proceed into marginal zone lymphoma. Okay, so I hope you have revised the important topic of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is a very easily understandable slide if it is given in the examination. Please get this correct. Okay, let's proceed to the next one. So yeah, one of the most easiest slide ever, multinodular goiter. Okay, so yes, thyroid gland is enlarged. Any enlargement of the thyroid gland is called by the name of goiter. And yes, the most common cause of goiter, if you take the whole world, you see that it is because of iodine deficiency. Now, you are actually classifying this as endemic and sporadic. As per our textbook, it is this endemic which is most common. Okay, and especially the people who are living in areas where there is less iodine, they are supposed to be having endemic goiter, or that particular area where there is lack of sufficient iodine in the diet followed by the people are supposed to be the areas endemic for multinodular goiter. The point is, endemic areas are typically said to be those areas like the Himalayas over there, Alps over there, hilly areas wherever you see, that will be the answer for endemic goiter, most commonly associated area, affected area. And yes, sporadic is not endemic. So sporadic here, females are more, yes, it is mostly present in females. Females are more as affected than males, and yes, it is typically seen in pubertal age group, because in during puberty the growth of the body increases, metabolism increases, it requires more energy. That means this particular hormone that is produced by the thyroid gland is obviously having a increased need of this thyroid hormone. Okay, and if you take a lot of goitrogens, typically these patients take a lot of cabbage or any member of the Brassicaceae family. But this is not something that in our settings, it is not very easily, we don't get a history where this patient is excessively taking goitrogens. But yes, there is an increased prevalence of sporadic multinodular goiter in patients who take a lot of or whose food is having a lot of content which is containing the Brassicaceae family members, cabbage and all those things. Obviously. Now, one of the most important feature is that actually whenever the T3, T4 production is decreasing due to any reason, there is an increase in TSH level, complementary increase due to TSH level, and this TSH level will cause this kind of a hyperplasia in the thyroid gland, and that is the basic reason for having goiter, so that this hypothyroid state can be actually compensated, so that the thyroid is enlarging in such a way that it can produce more hormone, so that it can become a euthyroid state. But yes, if the disease is very much severe, it can go into a hypothyroid state anyway. So yes, just the microscopy is important. Colloid filled follicles of varying sizes. You can see this size, big size, biggest size over here, and small size colloid filled follicles are there. And if you take the cross section and if you cut it, you have this gelatinous matrix like substance which is actually brownish in color. That will be the colloid itself. Excessive colloid is there. So you see colloid filled follicles of varying sizes and see lined by flattened cuboidal epithelial cells. So these cells which are lining it, these cells which are present over here, these are the flattened cuboidal epithelial cells. So cuboidal epithelium will be seen over here, and nuclei will be somewhere like this. Okay, yeah, so that's it. So with that, we come to the end of this discussion also. Let's proceed to the next one. So guys, this is a very important topic for your exam, that is papillary thyroid carcinoma, right? So the thyroid will be having the development of papillae like structures, and these are malignant papillae. So it is a typical papillae, so it has a fibrovascular core. Now when you take a cross section, it looks like this. So these are the papillary structures that you can see over here, right? Okay, so we will go into the further more details over here. The first question that they can ask you in papillary thyroid carcinoma is, how are you going to make a diagnosis? How does a pathologist make a diagnosis of papillary thyroid carcinoma? It is not based on metastasis. It is not based on invasion. Okay, it is not based on Samoma bodies that is present over here. Samoma bodies can be present over here also. It is based on the nuclear features of the malignant cells. It is based on the nuclear features of the malignant cells that you are going to make a diagnosis of papillary thyroid carcinoma. The moment you see these kind of nuclei in the slide that is given to you, your diagnosis is papillary thyroid carcinoma, right? So it is based on the nuclear features that the diagnosis is made. Typically, these nuclei are actually larger than the big nucleus, than the normal nucleus. So that is why we say it is having a nucleomegaly. Okay. Now, it has chromatin, but this time there is peripheralization of chromatin. Peripheralization, it goes into the periphery and will be sticking over there. So this is how it looks like. Peripheralization of chromatin. So the center of the nucleus will be white in color. It will be empty. The center is empty. So that is why it is called by the name of orphan Annie nucleus. That means orphan Annie was a character, a comic character who in the image they did not show the iris of this particular lady. So we call this as orphan Annie nucleus. Okay, and then if you typically see this kind of a nucleus over here, see this is the special nucleus that I'm going to show you here. So this nucleus is having a groove, right? It has a groove like this. Now this nuclear grooving is one of the very important features of papillary thyroid carcinoma. Typically you will get in most of the nuclei. Now the moment you see this, you can call this as coffee bean nucleus. Coffee bean nucleus. This looks like a coffee bean. That is why it is called by the name of coffee bean nucleus, right? And pseudo inclusions. These are pseudo inclusions. These are not nuclear inclusions as such. These are actually the cytoplasm that is invading into the nucleus. So when the cytoplasm enters into the nucleus, what happens is these kind of inclusion bodies are produced as a result of that. And once you see this with the microscope, you feel that this is an inclusion body within the nucleus. So you call the name, you call that particular structure as the pseudo inclusions, right? So these four important nuclear features should be very much thorough. You should be in a position to reproduce these at whenever a question is posed to you in the examination hall, right? This is the most important feature so far as the thyroid carcinoma. are concerned, right? Okay, so let's proceed to the discussion of the important genetic features of the four thyroid carcinoma: papillary, follicular, medullary, and anaplastic. Anaplastic is having the least prognosis, poorest prognosis, or I can say poorest prognosis. Okay, this is typically having the P53 mutations. So the survival rate of patients are very poor in that kind of anaplastic carcinoma, but that is the rarest. Okay, this is the rarest carcinoma. You can remember that. Papillary is the most common carcinoma and it has the RET PTC gene mutation. And all these features are with the help of these features that you are going to make the diagnosis of papillary thyroid carcinoma. The nuclear features are going to help you to make the diagnosis. Follicular thyroid carcinoma is actually due to the this is due to RET mutation, okay, RET gene mutation, and this is KRAS mutation. Follicular thyroid carcinoma. Medullary thyroid carcinoma has some other features, that is, this is the only carcinoma that is going to arise from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid, or the C cells of the thyroid, or the clear cells of the thyroid. These cells are secreting the calcitonin. So when these cells become malignant, they also will produce malignant calcitonin, and this malignant calcitonin or the calcitonin blood levels are going to act as the tumor marker for medullary thyroid carcinoma. So the tumor marker is calcitonin. Now this calcitonin, when it is produced in an excessive amount, they will be forming, they are actually defective proteins. So that will be the reason for amyloid deposition over here. So amyloid deposition is typically seen in medullary carcinoma. Amyloid deposition is present, and what is the type of amyloid here? Cal for calcitonin, right? So the amyloid deposition is seen in medullary carcinoma, and the type of amyloid is Cal, right? See guys, they can ask you another very important question, and we will still like to highlight it over here, that is follicular carcinoma. How will you distinguish this from follicular adenoma? See, the histopathological features are of follicular adenoma, that is a benign tumor, and follicular carcinoma, which is the malignant tumor. They are exactly similar. So how are you going to make a diagnosis of both of these things? See, in follicular carcinoma, you will be seeing the capsular invasion and vascular invasion. You should not say metastasis. Metastasis is to a distant site. So this is just invading into the capsule and also invading into the blood vessel supplying the thyroid. So that is why it is called as capsular invasion and vascular invasion. Capsular invasion and vascular invasion are the two important features that you look for so as to distinguish the follicular adenoma from follicular carcinoma. These two features are seen exclusively in follicular carcinoma, right? Okay. So rhinosporidosis is caused by an organism called by the name of Rhinosporidium seaberi, right? This was considered to be a fungus. Now the latest update is that this is a freshwater protestant. Okay, this is a protestant. Okay, protozoan protist it is. So we'll have to go with what the ENT textbooks are saying this. And what is this causing actually? It is going to cause granulomatous, chronic granulomatous disease of the nose, where there are polyps. So polyps will be formed in the nasal cavity, right? So this is how the polyps will look like if you take a cross section of that and see it under the microscope. So you will be seeing sporangia at different stages of development. So some of them will be small, some of them will be larger, and these sporangia will be containing the endospores, will be present inside the sporangia, and these are typically stained with the stain called as mucicarmine stain. Okay, so this is the stain that is specific for this, and as it is given in the textbooks of microbiology, I'm just giving this over here. So this is an H&E staining of that, and you can see these are the sporangia. So it is very easy to pick out this slide of rhinosporidosis. It is very easy to diagnose this very easily, right? So these are the sporangia that you can see over here. It has a numerous endospores which is present inside this. Okay, and overlying epithelium, this is very important so far as an answer in pathology is concerned. It is showing squamous metaplasia. See, the overlying epithelium, this epithelium which is overlying the sporangia shows squamous metaplasia. So what you can expect as a question on metaplasia is possible. What is metaplasia? Change of one adult cell type to another adult cell type, which is reversible in a way. But actually, these are all cell adaptations. That is why metaplasia is there, but it can progress into carcinoma. Okay. So this is metaplasia, right? Change of one adult cell type and to another adult cell type. So it becomes whatever was there, whatever columnar epithelium was there, it becomes squamous. So it becomes squamous. You call this as squamous metaplasia. right? So this is all we can learn from this. You have a drug here, isn't it? Radical surgery is what you do for that, and Dapsone is one of the drug which is having a good benefit whenever you give this to patients of rhinosporidiosis, and this is obtained when you take a bath in stagnant water. So it is a freshwater protestant. It can directly get into the nose whenever you're taken a bath in a pond or so which is actually stagnant, right? Let's proceed to the next one.